Um, first of all, check-ins. How are you? How are you? Was that your dad? I heard that.
Oh no, did it pick up on my mic? I'm
Well,
so
your mic is
sorry.
like. That's okay. See, this is why the wrap up is just like real. It's raw. It's us. Um, I'm super excited about all things Asians represent. I I had like an interesting week because like I started a new job, which like I really love, um, but I've had a lot more like since my hours have changed. I have like an extra hour in my day since I actually start work earlier, and I made a massive Notion page for all things Asians represent. I have to talk about it on stream.
Yeah.
Um, it has like it's got multiple color coded tables that outline like it's all sortable and everything with hosts, guests, release dates, what platforms they're on, topics discussed, everything for the wrap up, the podcast. I'm going to do all of our other shows. And then I used Miro and I made a board outlining the strategic plan of Asians Represent and our different like segments, like our content segments, our earning segments. And I've like planned out everything in this massive board. Um, and then I made our own little like Asians Represent CRM of Asian creators in the TTRPG industry, of every person who's ever worked with Asians Represent on something.
I am always astounded that you're just like, oh, I found an extra hour in the day, and I'm like here's like all this amazing stuff you built. I'm like, what?
I'm so hyped about it because it's allowed us to kind of like figure out what's coming next. Like, what are we doing now? What's next? And then what's like later on in the future. And I'm so hyped for what we're doing, because one of the things that we've wanted to do for a really long time is like set up a Patreon and figure out what that Patreon is going to, what kind of content is going to be there, and how we can provide a lot more value to the audience. It's also allowed us to kind of strategize as to what kind of content is going to be on the podcast and what kind of content is going to be streamed on the wrap up and go on the YouTube channel, because we do have these two different sort of content platforms that we can engage with, and we don't want it to all be the same. And so I have two podcast episodes that that we already have started talking about and planning. The first one is like Agatha, Jamie, and I talked about this, and it's going to be like it's a hot topic, and it's pay in TTRPGs. It's like pay structures and our experiences doing that. The second one, I've already talked to our guest about it. Our guest is going to be Emma for this podcast episode, and it's going to basically be the Japan you don't see in TTRPGs. And I think doing it as a podcast episode is going to be more valuable because it gives us more time to not be distracted by chat and to just kind of focus on the conversation at hand.
Yeah.
It's going to be dope. I'm so excited because that's something that, people, we talk about a lot. It's like, there's more than just samurais, but we never have an answer.
Yeah.
And I think the podcast has always been that. It's like, people are always like, oh, I don't want to watch 40 hours of you reading Oriental Adventures. But neither do I. I also don't want to be an asshole and ask you to explain it to me. Is there like a Cole's Notes that I can read? And now we have that, the podcast episode we did. Same thing for L5R. We'll eventually have one for Karatur. And then we'll eventually have one for Al-Qadim as well. And I just saw in the chat, solo RPGs. I think that's going to be a wrap-up. Right, Agatha?
Yeah, it could be.
I think we're gonna dive into it again because we've mentioned it when we talked about horror games, but we never did the idea of all of us play a game and then kind of talk about our experiences with that. Because I know Steve, you haven't played one yet.
No, I've been waiting. I've been waiting for like both my schedule to clear up, but also like the one that's really going to resonate with me, because some of the ones I saw, I'm like, I think this one actually might be too much for me, and I might not be able to finish it or like end on like a positive, pleasurable note. So
Right.
I gotta be somewhat careful, and I think that's not a knock on the genre. That's in fact, I think, quite big praise to the genre. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
You should wait on my game. My game is less depressing.
My game's super depressing.
So don't play Daniel's.
Don't play mine unless you're super into horror games.
Yeah, I think I have a skewed perception of solo RPGs because the first one that I saw was about like a very sensitive topic, and it was about school shootings. And the role you played and the way you interacted with the game, I was like, you know what? That's something I probably would never be prepared for. And I don't think I could ever engage with a game like that. But kudos to the creator for expressing, this tension in such a artistic, creative way.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt about my solo game. One of the things that I've experienced firsthand is being like an Asian, like the only person of color in a really small American town. And I have this really specific story, like content warning, it will only go for like 1 minute. I'll keep it at 1 minute. I'll actually time myself so that you folks can come back starting now. I did a road trip with an ex-girlfriend of mine, and we drove down from Toronto to Texas. And we stopped off, I forget where, but in a really, really small town. And we were at this little diner, and I remember sitting there next to a person, and they basically were talking about how they were going to go commit an act of violence against somebody in their community because that person had attacked their pet dog. And I was like, I've never felt so uncomfortable. And with everything that we've seen so far, in the world and being Asian, I was like, well, how do I rationalize my feelings and how do I turn them into something productive? And so I wrote a game about it. But it's a game about being an agent of this bureau that I designed, and you've captured an artifact, but your entire team is killed, and this cult is chasing you, and you can't escape. And that's 1 minute.
Damn.
Yeah. But yeah, I designed a solo game about that, and it was. I finally finished it. It's called Wicked Congregation. First draft finished. But that said, this episode is not about solo games. But solo games are a really great tool for approaching stories at your own pace and developing characters with the context of a story that you are telling. Now, when we're telling stories with other people, one of the ways in which we communicate the world, one of the ways in which we progress a story is through non-player characters. So hello, everybody. It's Friday, and welcome to the wrap-up. This episode is all about the non-player character, the NPC, the characters that the GM, the facilitator, the dramatic manager, the MC plays. It's something that, we talk about a lot, but we've never really talked about on Asians Represent. Steve and Agatha, we had an amazing conversation earlier on our, we just have our private chat. And Steve, the legacy of Steve and his interactions with D&D Beyond and D&D Discords. Do you want to share that example about art that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for any folks out there, I consider myself pretty active in like the official D&D Discord and the official D&D Beyond Discord. I think they're both good communities. There's fairly good moderation in both, and I feel comfortable generally in both those communities. But in February, I posed a question to both servers, and I said, hey, in light of a lot of events that have happened, and for a lot of folks who are part of the D&D community, I want to ask, how do you go about making sure that your NPCs are not white by default or by assumption? And that was obviously a very heavy question, and I try my best to kind of help facilitate that conversation and whatnot. And I got some really good answers, and then also some very odd answers. One answer I got was logically, in your world, shouldn't most people be Asian by default by numbers purely? To which I didn't engage at all with that. I thought that was just a microaggression and wrought out of a very bad faith place. And another was someone was like, I really struggle finding art of POC. I usually find white people in fantasy art, which I think is a pretty fair statement, and a lot of people can resonate with that. And they went on to say, I struggled to find pictures of like Indian coded characters or something East Asian or just generally people of color. And someone said, well, why don't you just take a white person picture? They didn't say that exactly, but take that picture and Photoshop it so their skin is darker and they look Indian. And I was like, that is also something I cannot right now engage with. And I don't know exactly how to engage with that comment because that one's not wrought out of bad faith, but it does make a lot of assumptions that I think a lot of people in the community would make with the best of intentions.
Yeah. When you said that, that's something that I think most people have who work as creators or any of this have encountered. Is that just change their skin color in Photoshop. First of all, it assumes that people have access to Photoshop, which is again very expensive. Second of all, it also assumes that in changing the art of a character, or the way they appear on art, you provide the GM or the person running the game with the tools to also make them a unique, distinct, and memorable character. It's not just the color of their skin and what the art looks like. It's, to me, a great NPC, and I think of this from a design perspective, is the suite of information, the tools that are provided to the GM or I provide myself that allow me to tell an interesting story. Right? So I think that there are two things we could talk about today. And we as a group can decide on that. The first one is, we can talk about, creating NPCs that don't default as white characters. That's one from that example, Steve, that you mentioned. The other is how we just create interesting NPCs. Now, what I would propose is actually we start with the latter and then go into the former. How do we create NPCs, and then where do we go from there? How does that sound?
I'm really into that, yeah.
Okay. So we've all worked on like a variety of projects. And I really want to kind of dive into what an NPC on paper looks like to the three of us. Now, this is like a super loaded question. The answer is going to unfold over the course of, this hour and a half that we have together. But I actually want to start with a little adventure called Hearts of Flame at Lan Biang in Unbreakable Volume 1, written by you, Steve. Now, right now, this is like your biggest writing credit. Yep. And I want to ask you, as somebody who has played a variety of games, how did you go about making your NPCs memorable when writing within the confines of 5th edition D&D?
Yeah. So I think I would start off right away saying that D&D was very confining when it came to writing NPCs. And that those constraints really came in like they need to have a class and a gender and a race. It has to fall within these specific buckets. And I felt that was very constricting. But I try my best to like work within that to make something that was enjoyable. So what I ended up doing, and I think is a very common strategy I do, is I take those constraints and I try my best to deconstruct them within its own framework. So what I mean is in that particular adventure, the bulk of the NPCs are monks who live in a monastery. And this monastery exists on a mountaintop where they focus on prayer and self-improvement. But generally they take in folks, strangers generally, to help them realize what they want to do with their lives. It generally is a place for lost people to find some guidance in a safe way that generally doesn't put a lot of pressure on them. As such, once I had that groundwork, my NPCs basically took everything about monks in D&D 5e, and I basically circumvented every single trope I could think of. So, these weren't people necessarily who were very religious, that were really into meditating and like could channel their chi really well. Some of these people were children who just generally didn't have a passion that they felt like they could follow through into a meaningful career choice. So they went to this temple, and this temple was like, you can talk to other people and you can stay here as long as you need to until you find some direction. It had people who had seen war and combat who suddenly felt very lost in their lives, and they came to this temple to both be again with other people as well as to hone whatever craft or skill they really, really took pride in. And there is actually, I think, a dozen NPCs in there that all have various kind of life stories that can really be, their tension can really be summarized in one sentence.
Yeah, what I think is really cool about what you did was in your adventure, also go to unbreakablerpg.com and purchase a copy of Unbreakable if you haven't. In your adventure on page 121 of the book, you actually have the stat for, a monk in this adventure. But what's really neat is on the previous 2 pages, you have actually outlined each individual character basically without stats. You've put their name, how to pronounce their name, which I think is really great and more people should do. You put their alignment. This kind of goes in line with, D&D's sort of traditions. But what I really think is neat about this alignment part, and we've had our whole talks about alignment, so I won't kind of dive into that, is that what you've done is that you've given each individual monk their own alignment, right? Rather than say like all monks have this alignment, you've given each individual one their own alignment, which has given them this sense of individuality. You've put a description, you've given them a little bit of a backstory, and then put any notes that might differentiate them from the stats that you've outlined. So Steve, I commend you at that. I think that's really great. Writing NPCs in D&D is like a challenge that I kind of had with, the Book of Inner Alchemy and Candlekeep Mysteries. Go buy that too, I guess. But buy that one from your local game store. For me, what I did was I tried to, I was working with wizards to obviously create the different actions that these characters had and everything like that. I put a lot of work into writing a description of what they look like and their backgrounds. But what I also did was I used tools that you're meant to use in character creation. So I put, personality trait, an ideal, a bond, and a flaw for these NPCs to give the GM more tools. One of the things I also tried to do was make sure that these NPCs were well situated within the adventure, right? The world around them, the world that I wrote around them, made sense within the context of the story that I told in the description. So the world felt like this NPC actually lived there and belonged there. But I will say that D&D is not necessarily a flawed system, but an imperfect system for presenting GMs or the facilitator of a game with the tools needed to create a memorable character. And so I kind of wanted to then go to Agatha. Agatha, you are the less D&D inclined of the three of us. And I kind of want to go to you now and, have you share a little bit about, a time when you've written out NPCs.
Sure. Yeah. I think the thing that I can think of is when I wrote one of the scenarios, I guess is the word for it, that you can use for One Child's Heart by Camden. And that, I don't know, well, I guess I can explain a little bit of what that game is about. It's set in like a sci-fi near future where you have the ability to go into people's memories and then kind of interact with it so that they experience it differently. And in the context of this specific game, it's children who are at risk, like at-risk youth, not I think they're youth, not children specifically. And then so you are like a team of professionals, so like a counselor, like a I think there was like a religious kind of like leader type of person, and like various things that are like professional people who are going into a child and interacting with their memories and to try to like help them have a more positive, I think, like to help them with like certain traumatic incidents that happened. And so I wrote, it was like as when it was on Kickstarter, and they as one of the tiers that they reached, I was one of the writers. And that one, I feel like that's a very, very different context from like how do you write an NPC for like a like mostly hack and slash kind of adventure, because it's very much like it's first of all, it's set in like basically like a real world, right? So the near future, and you're kind of writing about a kid who is at risk. So for me, it was very much like I started thinking about my own experiences and then like people around me, and then I wrote a specific scenario, which is like you basically write out, or I did. The format was like there were a couple of memories that the players would interact with, and then each one they would experience it and they try to talk to the kid and stuff like that in that instance. And then so I feel like it's just so different, but it's very much just like pulling from real life, and it's in a way easier because it's very much people would interact with it with the expectation that it does feel like real life. So then if I were to say like, oh, this kid is experiencing like racism at school, like people can be like, okay, I get that.
Well, that's a really good point that you make, in that there are to create a very broad dichotomy between our Steve and myself and your experiences. Two objectives when writing NPCs. One is, we see it a lot in D&D, but it's not necessarily a D&D thing, and it's that you have NPCs that are written with the purpose of driving the plot in a particular direction. They are a plot device. Many D&D NPCs you see, like in the big adventures, are like, okay, you have this NPC and this is the information. This is what they give to the players. And this is what they do to allow the players to advance beyond this character, right? And then there are the NPCs that not only add flavor to your story, but enrich your world. And D&D characters can do this as well. But D&D NPCs aren't often written, with that in mind. That said, what I kind of want to talk about are, examples of non-D&D games. So like Camden's game and others.
Yeah. By the way, that game is great. So if y'all want to check it out, go and get it. It's one of those games where you feel like it really moves you because everyone is trying together to like help someone, and then sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't, and there's something about it that makes you feel so sad but also so hopeful. It's an amazing game. One Child's Heart.
I already shared it in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah. Camden is an incredible designer, a great human being.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of want to talk about how, like, examples of, modules, adventures, games where we really like how NPCs are presented. And B, I would love to come up with, like, a loose framework between the three of us of what we want to see in an NPC when it's provided to us by an adventure or a world book.
Okay, so it's not like if you're a GM, what would you do? It's
Yeah,
more
it's,
like
it's if a
I
GM
was
or
getting-
it's like if you were a GM, what would you want?
right.
As well as if you were a designer, what would you want to provide a GM?
Yeah.
Right.
I can answer that
Yeah.
first, I guess. I for me, when if I don't have a lot of experience running games from modules, but I think I don't personally, I don't need a lot of backstory and text. That is not something that I engage with a lot. Like I'm not interested in it. But so what I would like is just like charts, and then so my favorite thing, I guess if it's a specific module, then I just want like very simple things. So for example, like 2 physical traits, and then like what they want and then what they need. So like just like really the bare bones, and then I can kind of play with it as I want. But that's also like, I guess, counter to running things from a module. I'm not really sure. But for me, that's what like, okay, so this NPC wants like, okay, they want to get rich, but what they need to do is to kick their gambling habit. You know, like stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this, when we talk about modules, I also want us to make the distinction between like, say, like a module and a narrative toolkit, right? Because a narrative toolkit might not necessarily be a campaign setting. It might not necessarily be, a game system of its own, but it kind of sits in between all of those. And my favorite, and I've brought it up so many times during Asians Represent, is Kidnap the Archpriest. I actually ran this recently for Emma, who appears on this show a lot, and like a couple of other friends, and Drew, who's also a mod and has appeared on Asians Represent as well. And I like Kidnap the Archpriest because it doesn't have any stats. There are no numbers associated with these NPCs. There's like a loose narrative structure. There's an objective that it tells you to do, but it doesn't actually tell you how to complete that objective, which I really like. And that's kind of what my taste in RPG product has kind of been driving towards. And in it, they provide you with NPCs in a way that, Agatha, I think you would really appreciate. They say, here's what they look like in like 1 or 2 sentences. Here's how their voice sounds. And I'm sure we're going to go back to this because not everyone, myself included, can do an accent. I'm not a voice actor. I'm just not good at it. It's one of the things that I'm actually really crappy at. So they say
there's also a difference between an accent and I think it's like a voice. Like those two things are not the same.
Yeah. So in this adventure, it says, okay, let's go to like, there is a the leader of the immortal capital, who sends you on this mission. His name is His Dread Majesty Gulfray II. And what's neat is that underneath the NPC's name, it says, as the PCs know him now. This can change. I've done this where I've written what the PCs have heard of this person. And so it can change. So it's its appearance. His face is on all the coins. Fine nose, thick eyebrows, harsh expression. That's what the PCs know of him because they haven't actually met this person. So they know of him from coins, which I think is a really cool thing to do to have as a GM, because if the players actually meet this character, he may look completely different from his public image. And there's something interesting you can do with that NPC there. His voice. The PCs have heard of his infamous rages and declarations. Every denial, rebellion, or act of defiance, no matter how petty, is deeply personal. He raves. That's all they've put. And then it has his wants, morality, intelligence, and stats. Now, under wants, it's put power, absolute and unquestionable. He firmly believes he is the heir to the world. That's it. Morality, ambiguous, but he has famously blinded, maimed, and castrated his enemies and relatives. And then for intelligence and stats, it's put NA for both of them. Do what you want. So I've kind of taken that structure as something that I've really appreciated. An NPC for me needs to have a name, some sort of appearance, maybe a quote, though quotes tend to kind of bottleneck you in a particular direction. I like a stat block. Now, I don't like a stat block in the D&D sense. What I've been doing is I would say as a noble with a kind of weapon, or as a knight with a blank weapon. So you could use it in any other system. So I'm not telling you to do this in D&D. So you'd be like, if it says as a knight with a halberd, you'd be like, okay, well, we're playing this game, and what's the equivalent to this in this game? Boom. Now I have it. Agatha, I love how you said something about like what they want
versus
did
what they
once.
need.
Yeah.
versus what they need, right? And for me, I really like that. What do they know? What information can they give the players? But also, what can the players give to them? There's a great, it's not quite a module. It's like, again, it's this narrative toolkit called A Pound of Flesh. It's an OSR thing. It calls itself like a module, but I think of it as more of a toolkit. And it's for a game called Mothership. So it's a sci-fi horror game. And in it, NPCs are presented to you in a really minimalistic way. They say, here's the character's name. There's a little bit of art. They tell you their hit points, some items that they have, a little description. And then they have, what can you do for them? And then they have, where are they and what are they doing? And these are all options that you can roll on like a D6, a D10, or whatever.
Oh, that's great. The where are they and what are they doing?
Yeah.
That is very useful for as like someone running a game. It's easier to set your scenes.
Yeah, and so it's like, what are they doing now? And so you have, as a GM, you can either roll on the table and have it random. That's kind of fun that way. Or you have some clues as to what this NPC's routine is, which I think is really interesting. In Kidnap the Archpriest, every single key NPC is on a table that outlines their activity over a 24-hour period. So if you're playing with...
Nice.
Because the adventure has a time-sensitive nature to it. So if you're like, at 8 a.m., what is this character doing? And it's kind of cool. And it's something that you don't see a lot. But I like the what are they doing now? Or where are they? Where can you find them? Because it kind of gives you a way to place that character elsewhere in case your players don't go that route.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what about you, Steve?
Yeah, this has been really interesting because I have similar ways that I do my NPCs and whatnot, but also I kind of frame it in a way that works better for my games. So my games have a more cinematic TV, like long-running TV series feel to it, where you know that I'm going in arcs and there's like an overarching like story that's going here, but also we're going to take tangents and we're going to have fun as we get there. So we're going to take 24 episodes to really tell how we get to see the boss and then fight the boss, and then we have like a party afterwards. So when I have NPCs, I have two questions I really ask myself, and then I kind of balance those in a way that I think will jive with the current context or story of the game. And one is, every NPC I introduce has a story purpose. Like they're going to be introduced for a very specific narrative purpose. So like I need this NPC to be introduced because I need some kind of guide, let's say, for the next area. Someone who like knows the things and can like help drop clues as to why certain things are the way they are. Or I need an NPC to create conflict. So I think very much in the terms of cinematically or narratively, what purpose do they serve? Second to that, and again, this is very similar to kind of the wants and needs. I always build my NPCs with what I just call attention. There's always something that is there that isn't resolved, but could get resolved, or maybe doesn't. And then I'm fine with either direction. So when I have this NPC that's going to drive that story, for example, they're the tour guide or they're the guide for the next section, I also build in them attention. There's a why they do it, maybe a want or a need, and I play within that idea. So if that tour guide doesn't like being a tour guide, they are in it because of familial pressures. And I think those two elements really give me everything I need for the NPC.
Yeah.
And then everything else then kind of falls out of it. So depending on the or depending on the game needs, I might then build them a stat block. But those stat blocks ultimately serve those two questions I have. What is their narrative purpose? And what is the tension that I'm trying to illustrate to my players?
I have thinking. Yeah.
You don't want to spoil anything for Dungeons and Asians? Is that what's going on here?
No.
Yeah, I do. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Daniel.
No, go ahead, Agatha.
I do. I like that a lot. The tension thing. I feel like now. Are we going to talk about if we're GMs, like how we do NPCs? Because I think that will be more relevant with the voice and then the
Yeah, I think
accent.
we should do that because I think one of the things, Steve, you brought up is like on one end you want to give the NPC like an agenda, right? A motivation or something like that. But I think one of the things from both a designer perspective and a GM perspective is you want to make the NPC feel like an actual entity in that world, like a person, or it doesn't have to be a person, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
And I think the key to making a good NPC can really be boiled down to how do you make sure you create a character that doesn't communicate to the players that the GM wants you to do something, right? That makes sense. Like,
Well,
I
yeah,
don't want
mean,
this character. I said character.
Caratur.
Wow.
Rut-row.
I don't want this character to exist. I don't want the players to think that a character exists simply because they are to give you a quest. I don't want that, right?
Yeah.
I want this character to exist because they live in this world. Now, before I say character again,
I'm not over the character.
There's a lot to unpack in that.
Yeah.
The reason why is because the reason why is because when I was working on this sort of Notion board, I had to write character a lot, and now it's in the brain.
I really like this idea. Sorry, go ahead, Agatha.
Oh no, I was just saying, it's okay. Like,
no, it's not.
We accept you for who you are, Dan.
It's not. It's not okay. It's not okay.
Moving on, because we don't have time to unpack all of that. But moving on. Daniel, that really resonates kind of like the way I view NPCs and whatnot. I'm sure a lot of folks in chat are familiar with like the Bechdel test, where you kind of like look at your story and it's like, do I have any marginalized people, specifically women, who don't frame their conversations for 60 seconds minimum outside of the gaze of men? And I think that's a really good test, and it really helps to deconstruct. Even that test itself helps to deconstruct preconceived notions. But tangent to that test is seeing if, even though you might pass that test, can any of the women, or more broadly marginalized people, be replaced with a post-it note on a stick? Because if so, that is also a problem. So NPCs in my games, I always ask myself, can they be replaced by like just a sign? Because if so, maybe they don't really need to be an NPC, or maybe I need to review kind of what I'm trying to do here, or what I am doing here.
Oh my gosh, Steve, you put so much effort into it.
What? Well, it makes a lot of sense, right? It's
great.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Like, do you want them to be a part of this world? Do you want them to be an actual living thing? Right?
I feel like so the way that I think about it when I'm writing for something versus when I'm running a game and I'm coming up with NPCs on the spot, it's very different, because I'm not able to think that fast. Be like, okay, but what are their motivations? Actually, I'm sure that could work, but I just don't do it that way. For me, I actually usually do it as a voice first, and the voice is a persona, and then I will develop what their wants and needs are as we role play it out. So that's actually very different.
And like to vibe off of that, like developing it as you go is also really important, right? Because you want the players to be invested in this character as well. And if you as a designer and as a GM are putting a shitload of work into like, okay, this character's backstory is this chunk of text and these are their stats, and the players are like, all I want to do is learn about this particular kind of bread that they make, right? That you as a GM have wasted a whole bunch of your time.
Yeah.
And if you force the players to use the stuff that you've written, you're also, not listening to the players. So you kind of have to find this middle ground. And I think the voice is perfect, right? Is a perfect kind of segue into that.
So like how I often think about things is, of course, like, so again, this is as a GM, MC, DM, as the person running the game. First of all, what kind of game is it? Like and again, this goes back to what Steve was saying about like, what kind of function do they serve? So is this a masks game? If this is a masks game, it's like, there always has to be at least one like parental / mentor figure, and like what kind of role do they serve? And then you're like, okay, so this player wants like a parental figure to rebel against. So like for Daniel, your character, right? Like in the Masks game. So I was like, okay, like then I think of it like, what kind of thing do they want to rebel against? And then I leaned into my experiences with Asian older like family figures and their expectations and the way that they interact with the younger people who are like, especially I feel like immigrant parents, that kind of separation,
expectations, differences.
Yeah, that's the separation in their experiences, and then the way that they're unable to communicate with each other. I mean, this all sounds very complicated, but the way that I did it was, I was like, oh, what was it like when my mom was like, why you need to practice piano more? So and then I would just like lean into that, like, so and like for me, posture is a very big thing for NPCs as well. Like when I played what is your character's name?
Tommy.
Yeah, when I played Tommy's mom, like I always stood straighter, and then I always talked a little bit quieter and a little bit slower, because that for me, that gave me an idea of that character who's like often like in control. She doesn't need to raise her voice, and she often speaks in directives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Tommy's mom, by the way, in the actual play, the new Shambhala on 800%, definitely check that out. It's a short run, but it's so dense, and I'll use that like very specifically. And all the NPCs, Agatha, you aren't doing accents, or I think it's fair to say you aren't really putting on an accent, but you are doing voices, and every single voice is very distinct from like a consumer point of view, and it was good.
I feel like I feel like there are so many signs that are leading us back to that series.
Pretty much, yeah.
Steve, you're gonna have to...
New Shambhala.
New Shambhala. We can call it the fall of New Shambhala.
Oh no!
Uh-oh.
Not our precious Shambhala.
So much work went into building it, and you're just gonna destroy it, and like I'm into that.
I love that.
I
love that. No, I think it would be really cool to go back to those characters, especially that like we as a group have become, we know each other a lot better. We've been through so much together, and like, our skills and our tastes have all changed. Like I would really love to go back to those characters, and you're doing the eyebrow thing too.
Yeah, I've been down. Hey.
Yeah, I think that'd be really fun. I mean, we have so many ideas.
Yeah.
But it's all about like time and prioritizing those things.
Yeah, so for me sometimes it's the physical things that lead me to understand the direction of the internal things. So like the motivation and stuff, sometimes because I already affected this like voice and posture, then that helps me know, like kind of figure out what motivation it is. Again, this is when I'm GMing and like I'm coming up with stuff on the spot. I don't know, what about for the rest of you?
Yeah, so I'm also not 100% comfortable doing accents. It never really jived with me. In addition, I have a lot of microaggressions where people like really made fun of the way I would try to do accents because I'm just not good at it, to be quite honest. And in a table setting, a lot of people would really make fun of me for it. So I just don't do them anymore because it's not worth the pain. That said, doing voices I think is really interesting. The idea of kind of the physicality of it. Once I understood that voices are a very physical thing, I got really into it. So the idea of kind of like raising my chest or lowering my chest, or changing my cadence, really impacted the way that people perceive a person's identity. And I always thought that was just so fun and interesting, where I could both use preconceived notions of what it means to speak softly and speak where you're not quite sure where you're going with it, versus using that voice and subverting that trope, or just like completely shattering expectations. To me, that has always been such a pleasurable, joyful experience.
Hello, Raiders.
Hello.
Hello. For those of you who have just joined us, we are talking about NPCs. What we like to see as a consumer of tabletop RPG content, and what we like to put out into the world as TTRPG creators. So yeah, this is, honestly, this is, I'm really happy that we are having this conversation. I'm also a little bummed that it took us this long to do it. I think
it's. Sorry, I was gonna say, I think it's a topic that's so like top of mind, but actually quite difficult to deconstruct. It on the surface, I think it seems like a very easy topic, but generally, when you get down to it, what we're talking about is the way fictional characters show their identity, and that can actually be quite complex. And there's a lot of depth in there.
Yeah, and it's this give and take between what you have written on the page, or what has been presented to you on the page, and what the players want, right? Like,
Yes.
I think a big one for me in recent memory is Shuang in our D&D in Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
Shuang was like this one-off character. I was like, it's just this scholar who's in this library. I had her kind of as like a naive character who never left the walls of the city. And then Amar was like, I want to eventually smooch that character. And I'm like, okay. Let's take this character and start adding more depth to the character as the story progresses. But that was like an instance where I was like, I had no plan on actually having that character be there later. And like that's literally happened for every single NPC in our game. In all 11 episodes that we've done so far, all of the NPCs that y'all really clung to were characters I did not plan. Speaking
of which, you need to bring back the Simu character with the sexy hair.
The long hair, because
yes,
Simu was Steve's hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, pretty much.
Also,
because I missed that character.
Also, to specifically call it explicitly, when I talked about NPCs having a story purpose, aesthetic is a valid story purpose. Having an NPC that's purely for the aesthetic, that 100% is valid, and movies do it all the friggin' time. And yeah, it works.
Yeah. So talking about accents, my personal opinion is that unless you're a professional, like voice actor, I don't recommend doing it, because there's just so many ways. First of all, I feel like within certain contexts, like if you're just playing with your friends and like you all know each other very well, I guess, and you do accents, like you're basically only impacting your group, right? Like depending on how you're doing, like, but I feel like in general, there's just, you don't know what kind of experiences people are bringing to the table and what kind of baggage they may have. So like, and also it's hard to be an objective judge of your own skills. So I might think, oh yeah, I'm pretty good at like doing an Australian accent, and then I do it, and then people are like, I don't understand what you're saying.
Crikey, that's a critical hit. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like something like that. Like and so it can vary, and accents are a thing where if you don't do it well, it's so easy to become offensive. Also, accents are a thing where even when you do it well, you can also be offensive, right? So I think it's really not it's it's much better to err on the safe side and not do that, because there are so many other ways that you can indulge in your inner actor when you're trying to present a character without doing accents, because again, there are voices, right? Like things like where you like raise your pitch and then you talk higher, or you lower it and then no,
Yeah.
they're a different person, right? Like, so it's, you don't need accents. I think it's okay for professionals to do it because it's just such a different context. But
Yeah.
if you're not, I just don't recommend it.
Yeah. And to that point of professionals and whatnot, those professional actors, they have coaches, they have professional support to help them get through that. And for a home game, you almost certainly don't have that. And although you can put in the effort, you can put in the work and whatnot, your system is not there to help guide you through it, as well as to coach you through kind of how certain accents come to be, and potentially how that identity and that accent are tied together. You just might be missing that through no fault of your own. That just might be purely something you stumble across. And to Agatha's point, you don't know how someone's going to hear that and how they might resonate with that, or maybe feel tense about it.
Yeah, and I feel like context is very important, because if I were playing a game, say like with my all of my friends who are, let's say, who are all Chinese, and this one of them does like a Chinese accent, I'm like, okay, like that's I can vibe with that, right? Because it's like kind of like, oh yeah, like that's like my mom, or like that's like your mom, right? Like, or like that's like my uncle. So it's not offensive because we're all within the same context. But if I were but if, for example, if I were playing with my other friends who are none of them are even Asian, and I do a Chinese accent, I'm very sure that I would make pretty much everyone at the table very uncomfortable, because they're just like, I don't know how to interact with this, right? So it's like, it's not even like, if you feel like, oh, I am from this background, so I'm okay, it's okay for me to do it, because sometimes you're making other people uncomfortable anyway. So it's just better to ease off of that.
I've always felt that like trying to do an accent wholesale is like trying to cook outside of your experience. Like if you're in the kitchen and you don't have any experience making a certain type of culture's dish, you just decide you're going to go wholesale and just try to do it start to finish, it's probably not going to be great. In fact, you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes, and you might not even know what those mistakes are. But if you hear an accent and you are very specific about what you like the spice, you like how sweet it is, you like this one particular ingredient, and you just want to try to incorporate it, I think you really reduce the risk that might be there. So, for example, a specific accent might pronounce certain vowels in a very specific way. Maybe just focus on that. Just do that one tiny thing that very slightly modifies the way words are said, and that might be, interesting and fun. And for a home game, it might be, just enough to really let people know that this is, you put some work into it. And I think that is, a process that I think might work for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah. The accents are something that I've always struggled with in play. So yeah, I completely avoid them. One thing that, I mean, it's easy to, for a one shot, think a lot about, okay, like what are the NPCs' goals? What are they going to do? You can write this stuff out and kind of react to the players. But if you're doing a long form game, what's the best way to kind of keep track of these NPCs and bring them back later? For Dungeons and Asians, one of the things that we've done is we made a show Bible. And in our show Bible, it has a list of every single NPC or player character who becomes an NPC that we've ever encountered in the series so far. from like Sexy Simu Liu, who appears in episode 2, eyebrows, to like all of your characters from Gen Con Live. I wrote them all down there with little details on each one, so I can remember what episode they appeared in, and even if they're mentioned. So one of the things I recommend is by taking a more minimalistic approach to your NPCs, you give yourself a way to A, keep track of them, and B, make sure that your players can interact with them in the world that they live in a way that isn't restrictive. And I think that's something we've talked about. It's like ease, collaborative storytelling are like two really big things with NPCs, because you are going to be put in a situation where, your players go into a store and then one player is like, what's the name of the shopkeeper? I want to know about them. But you have to kind of come up with something. So I kind of want to go into, and this is kind of a tough question, but I really like the idea of basically like strip mining TTRPG tools for use in other games. And I want to know if there are any that you would recommend. Games with like really memorable characters, books, shows, anything like that with memorable characters that people can use for inspiration when they're writing their own games. A place where you can like quickly take a list and then use, or a table that you can quickly take. One that I've always wanted us to kind of read, but I feel uncomfortable about, well, at least I felt uncomfortable doing it. Mostly in the early stages of our podcasting, was Feng Shui 2, the game. It's like one of the most requested ones. Because, after Kindred of the East, which we still eventually have to go back to, I just don't want to, because it's so bad. But in Feng Shui 2, there are actually tools in that game for distinguishing between like Hong Kong characters and like mainland Chinese characters. And it's like an element of the game that I've wanted us to kind of take a look at, but it's also something that I don't have expertise in. So there are a lot of tools out there that are being used by people to create interesting characters. Are you folks familiar with Donjon?
Yeah, I know that name from like generators.
Yeah, so Donjon is a really popular online generator, and it's one that I use fairly frequently in some of my like more casual games that don't use Asian themes. And Donjon actually allows you to generate random towns, random like cities, world maps, and NPCs. And it will tell you their like alignment, a name, an ancestry, a role in society, as well as a little description of what they look like. And it also adds like a little flair, whether they be like extravagant in personality or if they have like a unique pet or something. But that's a tool that, with some modification, I recommend to most people to try. Simply because it has some really cool stuff. So I'm going to share that in our chat. But I'd also love to hear from you two. Like, what are some tools that you use to maybe seek inspiration for NPCs or even generate them on the fly?
So this is going to sound weird, but in the pre-COVID times, I would go to bars a lot. I would go to these places and I would sit down at the bar and I'd order my drink and my food and my snacks, and I would talk to absolute strangers, which I recognize as a privilege that I have, the way I present and whatnot. But I would actually just sit around and just talk to strangers all the time. And the majority of the NPCs I have are actually just based off of real people who I've just met randomly. And that's actually been very pleasurable for me, and also like a very rewarding experience. And I always get feedback like, Steve, your NPCs feel like so real. I'm like, it's because they're based on a real person who I met. So the majority of NPCs are actually based on experiences I've lived through conversations and whatnot, and that just has served me really, really well.
Me too. Me too. I have one of my friends for games that you use Roll20. He actually goes to these. He goes to these actor sort of databases.
Mm-hmm.
And he just finds random actors and he
Yeah.
uses their like headshot and the bio that they put for themselves in like modern settings for his NPCs.
Oh wow.
Yeah. What about you, Agatha, though? What do you use for inspiration when it comes to NPCs?
I have Pinterest boards, multiple Pinterest boards. I have one Pinterest board called Portraits, and then I have one called Real Person Portraits. And
Portraits.
yes, because those things are of course different. And I have one called Historical Portraits. And then one that is monster inspiration. So I feel like that is basically how I do it. A lot of times if I feel like the pictures are more inspiration for players. But how I think about it is kind of similar to you, Steve, where it's I just think of people I know.
Yeah.
And then
Like Tommy Moon's mom is definitely someone who like you kind of know already.
It's like all of our
Yeah.
moms.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like all of our moms.
or like a facet of my mom. I'm not gonna say that my mom is just like that, but yeah. So that's how it is for me. But if you want I feel like pictures are great.
I agree.
Pictures
Like
are great.
they just inspire you, and then you look at some things and you just get a vibe, and then you're like, okay, this is the vibe.
So you know
So
what?
if I can,
Oh, go ahead.
so I was gonna go on a tangent, but Daniel, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say you know what I really about pictures. First of all, like my favorite thing about Pinterest is like when we confirmed that Kiana was gonna play the Empress, Kiana sent me a Pinterest board.
Me too. Holy crap.
I thought it was great. But with regard to pictures, you know, one of the coolest things that I saw, and I plan on doing this in the future, is when we were playing Apocalypse Keys, Jammy had this like Google sheet with NPCs that were named and had a little picture for them, but then had information to fill out as we encountered that NPC that we would add to, or that, you know, Jammy would add to. And I thought that was really clever because Jammy had a place for this NPC and an idea of what they were in the story and in the world, but had intentionally left space for the players. And I think that intentionality is super, super important. And it was a part of this big document that we were using, and Jammy was like, okay, anything else we add here? Yeah, who's this person? How do you know them? What was the last time you saw them? And then that all goes into a document that we can all refer to. Yeah,
that is brilliant. I feel like playing online and using Google Sheets is just it can be so good. Because everyone has access to all the information, so including like the players, right? So when you're referencing people, you can be like,
yeah. And if you're using tools like Roll20, shout out to Roll20, sponsor of Asians Represent, you know, just make those NPC handouts available to everyone and editable by everyone.
Yeah.
Super simple.
Yeah.
So this is really funny because it reminds me of one tactic I've used in a couple of my games where I have a lot of trust with my players and whatnot, where they'll meet an NPC and I will very transparently tell them, I did not plan this NPC. I have no idea who this is. Would anyone like to build this NPC or play this NPC right now, given these one or two prompts? And because I have this, like, you know, relationship with my players, oftentimes those two prompts are like enough for somebody like, yeah, I resonate with that. I'm going to play that. In which case I'll go, okay, would you like me to play your character? And then I will role play as their role play character, and they will role play as this newly made up NPC, which is later again going to be role played by me. And this is like this really weird exchanging of hats. And it's hilarious because for anyone who's not directly involved in the interaction, it's just like it's almost like a fun little jab at how we play our characters and our mannerisms. But it's also really a great time to just remind ourselves it's just a game. We're here to have fun. And also, we have this trust, and we can just exercise this trust through this very small mini game, I would call it.
Yeah, and I mean the big thing there is like your group has to have that established trust.
That's absolutely, that is fundamental to that way of doing things. And for a group fresh out of the gate who I haven't played at least X amount of games with, I probably wouldn't even consider that as an option.
Yeah, I've got it in. I'm playing 2 games on Sunday. One Sunday like morning, early afternoon, and then one Sunday evening. One I'm running Candlekeep for two kids, Ken's kids, and Ken. So I'm super excited for that. And in the afternoon or the evening, playing a game where the characters are actually space podcasters. It's Coriolis, but they were like, we want to be correspondents and we want to be searching for like the real news, the great stories. And one character was like, I want to be a podcaster. So they're like they're literally, their spaceship is a podcast studio going through space. And I'm like, okay, now that we have our group concept and we have an understanding of like the tone that we want to establish, this is why that session 0 is so important. I can now craft my NPCs around that. And so I think like while we're, it's great to do all of our prep, it's important to make sure that we establish what's important first, and that's the characters. Because you as a GM can go and create all these really dope NPCs. You can give them their own unique voice, their mannerisms, their activities, what they do. But if your players and the majority of the table decide that they want to do something that's tonally very different, you want to make sure that your NPCs kind of vibe with that as well. You want to make sure that you find middle ground between what the players want and what you as the facilitator, the dramatic manager wants. So I wanted to throw that out there. I wanted to make sure that we're not only, advocating for easy to use, relatively minimalistic story first NPCs that are well situated within your world, but also well situated within the story that everyone at the table wants to tell. And again, we are playing games in a COVID pandemic world right now. And we can't, and we're not at cons. So, this is a little bit different than if you're at a con, because at a con you have to be a little bit more reflexive and you have to deal with different expectations that just kind of show up at your table as well. I find like running games at cons to be very stressful for that reason. Especially when I was testing out Ross rifles. That was very stressful.
Yeah. Agatha, I wanted to come back to your Pinterest board because I think Pinterest boards are a wonderful way to kind of get NPC inspiration. And I find the effort to be not really inaccessible to a lot of people. It's quite easy to kind of like add to a Pinterest board.
Yeah.
But if I can circle back to a tension that I expressed earlier on, I personally find it very difficult to find fantasy art. Like if I were to type in like human fighter into Google Images, the majority of the images I get back will be white people. And it will be very difficult for me to find people of color. Have you experienced like that kind of difficulty as you kind of build these Pinterest boards?
Yes, I have. I don't have like a solution for it. I accept whenever I see a picture. Sometimes I just fall into Pinterest rabbit holes, which happens to the best of us. So don't shame me. But I see one that like it's like clearly like a Western fantasy setting, but like a person of color or just someone that is someone that just doesn't have that normal kind of like I'm an attractive fit person, also I'm white body type kind of thing, then I get really excited and I save it. But I do have a separate board that was specifically for running Hearts of Wulin games or playing Hearts of Wulin games that is like all Asian or all Chinese specifically, or people of Chinese descent. So that's my only way of countering it, but I don't really know. That is a problem still.
I like I like taking screenshots from like movies and TV shows to use, and so not just like still art, but like just like a little screenshot of a character that I see. Like for instance, like if I want like Chinese characters in different settings, like Longest Day in Chang'an has so many cool characters.
Yeah.
Right.
Bro,
That you
I
could just,
got you.
that
I,
you could
you
just-
should. I need to share with you my Hearts of Million
Yeah.
board.
Yeah,
'Cause
I want to
it's-
see that. You maybe
it's
we
pretty
should
good.
maybe we should do a you know what I think we should do for a wrap up? I think we should actually share different not go through our Pinterest boards. I think we should share our different virtual tools for organizing ideas. Right?
Oh yeah.
Because
Oh,
like
yeah.
I'm sure we all use different ones, right? Like the one that I really like is Milanote. I really love Milanote. Not OneNote, Milanote. I really like to use Milanote because it's kind of like Pinterest, but it just kind of visually works for me. But I would love to see your Pinterest board.
Yeah, my Pinterest boards are pretty great. Not to toot my own horn, but I love them so much.
Yeah, I
Do
want
you
to see that.
Do you share your Pinterest boards with your players, or is that just for you and for your process to like play out the NPCs?
Most of the time when I run games, my players also have their own Pinterest boards, so they don't
Great.
need mine. But I'm always down to like, yeah.
So there's a really good comment in the chat that I think we should turn our attention to by Aimless Wanderings. So the comment, because I know there are a lot of people who just kind of listen to the YouTube videos. The comment is, I have a lot of anxiety about this. I'm an artist and don't really care if people want to use my art as character portraits for non-commercial things. But I've seen a lot of other artists express a lot of distress at the idea of people using their using their work out of context, whether for commercial use or not. It's valid.
Totally.
It's valid. You know, for me, it's like if you have the means, like commission art. Like that's what we did for Dungeons and Asians. Now instead of using proxies, we have like actual art. It's why I, for the most part, like to use screenshots from like TV shows and movies. Like my current Mothership character is actually like Danny DeVito from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia at laser tag, because that's the persona that my character took on.
Right.
But yeah, it's a valid point. There are a lot of really great artists, you know, out there who are, you know, putting out art into the world. So if you are, you know, doing a podcast and if you have the means, like, and you know, you've grown to really love a character that you're using long term, I highly recommend commissioning a piece of art if you can. Because A, you know, you can support, you know, an artist anywhere in the world, and B, you know, you get a piece of art that is yours, that I really like. I loved the idea of having an Asian Jedi that looked like me so badly, and I haven't even used it for a game yet, but I commissioned a piece of art because I wanted one, and because I had the means.
I feel like another one of Aimless Wanderings, like the next
Token
comment is
packs.
also great. Yeah, to get NPC character token packs that have like different appearances, ages, and so on. That's so good. I would love that.
So you can get those. So you can go to places like Drive-Thru RPG, and they have like RPG stock art that you can buy. Like some of them are like, you know, the one that I just found is human female samurai bushi. But it's what you would expect. But you could always search on, you know, Drive-Thru RPG for art that you can actually purchase. There are also things like, I've mentioned this one before, but there's a creator named who goes 2 Minute Tabletop. And I really like 2 Minute Tabletop because, you know, there are maps that are pay what you can, but there are also like tokens that you can buy. So you can actually buy tokens that you could use on your virtual tabletop. So definitely. I like the idea of, supporting a creator if you can. So yeah, you can go on Drive Through RPG, find stuff there. You could always go on the Roll20 marketplace as well, find stuff there. And then another one, because I like their style, is 2 Minute Tabletop.
Yeah, I use a lot of their stuff. It's great. I wanted to mention also that, art and tokens is definitely one valid way to play your tabletop RPGs. But, pre-COVID times, all my games were in person and tokens weren't really a thing that we would use. It would all be theater of mind. So a lot of our descriptions would have to be verbal and whatnot. So there's limitations with that. You get a lot of speed with that, but you also kind of lose that nuance where an image can really tell you a lot. So I had to be very careful to make sure that I was making sure that my players, through no fault of their own, would code characters as white in their head as a default. And again, not a fault of their own, but kind of a system that we are in, where the media that we are bombarded with and that we consume drives us towards this kind of assumption. So to help deconstruct that, one really easy way for me is just to describe NPCs based on celebrities and movie characters, or I would just say this NPC is Michael B. Jordan, but he's a bard. And that generally was good enough. I could then kind of flex and give more details and whatnot, but with just less than a dozen words, I was able to generate an image in someone's head that was very specifically non-white, and also I was tied into the world. And then the rest just became ways to kind of refine what's going on.
That's really great to use real life actors or just persons of renown to signal, instead of being it's a person of this color.
Yeah, that's why I said
that's much more awkward.
Sexy
Yeah.
Simu.
Yeah.
It would have been awkward for you to be he's a sexy Chinese man. I would have been taken aback by that. But Sexy Simu Liu, that was so much more rich and meaningful to me as a player. So that was great.
Awkward. Yeah.
That,
way
can you
less
believe that was
awkward.
2 years ago.
Oh my god.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Memories.
But no, I do the same thing too. For my for one of my Delta Green characters, because our GM likes us to have portraits. My last one is I went through Louis Tan, but in three different things. I was Louis Tan into the Badlands, Louis Tan this, and it was just all the different ones, because that's what I wanted my character to look like, and my character didn't have an Asian sounding name.
What I really like about that strategy too is because I don't have an expectation that everyone knows every single celebrity, especially the celebrities of color and their real names. That I think is an unreasonable expectation. But it allows me to do is be oh, let me pull this YouTube clip real quick. And then we get to see that actor in motion, acting and doing things. And then that allows more kind of flexibility and fluidity within their theater of mind, and helps to kind of grease the gears and help them kind of, play around with their own mental imagery. And I think that's a very meaningful and impactful thing. And I have no clue what's going on in their head, but I at least know that we at least saw this one YouTube clip, and we can start there.
Yeah, that's a great one. I've done that one on assignment too, when working on a freelance thing. They're always okay, well, we need some references for the art, and I'm okay, let me make you references. Let me make you a mood board with pictures, videos. I also like videos because they kind of give you a full wraparound of what outfit they're wearing too.
Oh yeah, outfits, clothing is a really, really good one.
Cargo pants.
That's some that I often struggle with describing. Sometimes I struggle with describing clothing, especially the ones that I want to code as a specific culture. Sometimes it's very difficult for me to describe a piece of clothing without actually just showing the image. And I think that's pretty natural, I think.
I've also gone into tools like Hero Forge, and I've made my character there, and I've just taken a screenshot of what they look like. This is a pose, and this is what they've got, because you have such precise control over what goes where.
Mhm.
I like doing that. Also, like Hero Forge, another great tool. If you're playing in person and you have the means, you can design your own character that way.
True.
True. So one of the things, it's been a very long week for us, and one of the things I think we should do is end our stream by rating somebody.
Yeah.
Now, Steve, you have outlined in our chat 3 different people to stream, to raid. Who are we going to raid?
I mean, I feel like you kind of have an idea of who you'd like to raid.
Go
But
for it.
I want us to all pick. Because I think they're all 3 very valid people to raid. But okay, let's do it. Now, but before we do that, I do want to kind of summarize what we've talked about. Creating NPCs at the table is harder than many people think it actually is. And when I say it's difficult or hard, I say that, in creating nuanced characters that players can get attached to, that have strong agency, that are interesting, it takes a little bit of effort, not only on the GM side, but also on the player's side. It takes that collaboration, that back and forth, to create memorable characters that can kind of follow your player characters on their journey, or even, be revisited later. So, we encourage you folks who are watching on Twitch right now or on the YouTube VOD to, let us know. What kind of tools do you like to use for creating NPCs? Do you like to use Donjon? Are you a big fan of like the NPC table generator in Maze Rats? Do you use Dungeon Crawl Classics to create your level 0 funnel characters and just make them NPCs? What do you do? Let us know in the comments, or you can let us know on our Discord server. Now, right now, we are actually allowing and accepting new members into the Asians Represent Discord server. It's a community that not only the 3 of us, but the rest of our admins, and our amazing moderators have worked really hard to make a safe and, I would say, collaborative space. It's a place where hard conversations can happen respectfully, and we kind of closed down new invitations for a while, but now we feel comfortable enough to add new ones. Now, in order to get into the server, we used to just share the link in the Twitch chat, but now what we're doing is we're asking you to send us a DM. You can send us a DM on Twitch, or you can send us a DM on Twitter. Our Twitter handles are on the screen, so Daniel H. Kwan, DEEEM Steve, and Mighty Shrimp with 2 Y's. Send us a DM. Asking us to join the Discord server. We're opening up a set amount of spaces, but if you aren't a member of our Discord server, send us a DM. We'd love to have you. I want to let you know that we are prioritizing Asian members because this is a space that we've created for Asian folks. But yeah, let us know. We'll be doing this for a bit. So yeah, send us a DM on Twitter or Twitch. We'll get you a link squared away. Happy to have you, and we're excited for you to join us in this conversation, whether or not it's on Discord or if it's on Twitch, in our YouTube comments, or on other social media platforms. Steve, Agatha, as usual, thank you so much. I came out of this with a lot of really cool tools. I really want to try your tool, Steve, for let's switch places. I really want to try that.
It gets kind of funny where you kind of again, you have to have a ton of trust, because it's kind of like roasting each other, and you kind of read each other in the drag scene sense of things. But
that's so great.
I have some.
Daniel, we have to do this.
Oh yeah, we should do this on Dungeons and Asians.
Yeah.
I have a player in my group, so I've got a mixed group. I have 2 players who have never played this game before. I have somebody who I've known for a year, but we've only played TTRPGs together twice. And then I have one person in my group who I've known for almost a decade, and we've played TTRPGs for that long. So I look forward to doing that with him. But I really look forward to using that idea, and I hope that you two, got something out of this conversation too, because I feel like not only is Agents Represent great for our audience, but it's great for me. I learned so much from everybody who comes on the show.
I'm now thinking about the tension point thing now, and that's like a cool way to think about NPCs as well. It's useful.
I'm thinking about polishing off my Pinterest account so I can start making mood boards.
Oh heck yes.
Yeah, I gotta make a Pinterest account.
Actually, Agatha, I'm glad we mentioned this because I have a DM with another friend of mine, and our chat is just art of POC. No other messages. It's just art that we thought was really cool, but only POC. And we're like, it's what we want.
What if we maybe on Discord did like a, hey, everybody get your Pinterest boards out and let's do a show and tell of our RPG Pinterest boards.
Everyone show you Pinterest boards.
Yeah.
This is my real person portraits.
I think
this is my East Asian portrait.
I think that could be really cool, right?
Yeah.
So let's try that. But anyways, thank you folks for coming out to the wrap up. We appreciate you.